So a couple of acronyms here that I wanted to point out. CDRH is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health within the Food and Drug Administration, administrator at the FDA. So, and Digital Health Center of Excellence is DHCOE, as we call it internally, and I think even externally at this point. First I want to start with what CDRH is. Basically, our vision is that patients are at the heart of what we do. And so it's driven from the perspective that we want to make sure that patients get access to high quality medical devices first in the world, but these are to be safe and effective medical devices and devices which are important for public health issues. And so we always want to be thinking about that perspective. So we are, and I think our center director, Dr. Jeff Shuren, has always mentioned, like, our goal is to make sure that devices come for the American public first compared to the rest of the world, but also that they have to be safe and effective. We're not bringing any device into the US just like that. So I wanted to just mention that the Digital Health Center of Excellence is sort of new. It's formed around 2021. And it's not like the agency was not doing digital health activities. It's just that we formalized sort of this structure of coalescing around digital health and building this approach. And you can see, if you read from left to right, like there are a lot of different digital health technologies, DHTs, that are impacting healthcare across the world. And you are obviously examples of some of the people who are working in that space. And some of the things we're seeing or we are authorized to go to market, for example, are related to using like AI for skin cancer evaluation, or for using therapy devices for reducing sleep disturbances for psychiatric conditions, so on and so forth. The last year, we had focus on 4 different areas, which is basically like we wanted to make sure that innovation that is being done is responsible innovation. And we have provided a list of about 700 ML devices that were authorized by the FDA. I think this was in 2023, and we recently, I think last week, released a newer update, which brings it to about 885 devices, if I remember correctly, or 884 or something like that. So anyway, so that's an increasing list of AI/ML-enabled medical devices that have been authorized. Just to be clear, these are all locked devices. That is, the AI models are locked and they're not learning or evolving or adapting in the field. So we also published a list of frequently asked questions, because we have a digital health inbox, which I'll talk about later, where we get questions from from the public and from industry, like asking about general questions about their product or about certain aspects of evaluating guidances and those kind of things. And we decided that there was a common thread among a lot of these questions. And so we put out this FAQ because of that. We also wanted, as I said, safe and effective are the key words to drive the agency. And so we want to make sure that that's true. And so we have issued draft guidance on a concept called predetermined change control plan for AI-enabled devices. And we also issued a final guidance related to what is required for device software functions in pre-market submissions. And I'll talk through some of these definitions as I go down some of the slides, so it'll be more clear what exactly I'm talking about. And then we want to make sure that we are not working in isolation, but we are working with all communities in the US spectrum. And so we have created a digital health advisory committee, and basically this is to get views from subject matter experts to help us as an agency be able to better work with the DHT community and build more understanding in that space. We have also been being a federal observer to the Coalition for Health AI, or CHAI, and also working internationally with multiple regulatory agencies like the British agency MHRA, Canadian agency Health Canada, IMDRF, which is the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum, a digital health think tank, and others. And so this is especially valuable when we are looking to see early signals from devices that are not working, right, in third country, for example, or and so this allows us to coordinate responses across the globe when recall has to be done at an international level. So in order to develop policies, like, for example, predetermined change control plan, if you want to, or good machine learning practices, if you want to build a common approach to some of these technologies across the globe, that every device manufacturer or every consumer is aware that there's no discrepancy in how you interact with a device in one country versus another country, is still aligned on that. And so that's some of the thinking we have been doing and building the relations on that space. We also, I mean, as we all know, like information is key. Disinformation, misinformation can be a big problem in this space. So we are trying to increase health literacy, and advancing equity, making sure that all populations are represented when devices are being evaluated within the FDA. And so one of the things we've been looking at recently is looking at augmented reality and virtual reality. We released like an infographic in English and in Spanish to help patients and healthcare professionals understand like what is the technology that's there for AR, VR. And finally, we had a final guidance on use of digital health technologies, and I'll talk about this one in this slide deck as I go forward. Some of the things we're currently working on, like we are planning to publish the final guidance. So as you may or may not be aware, draft guidance is not enforceable. It's just a draft. So it is just allowing you, the community, to provide input on like what exactly helping the FDA think through is thinking about particular aspect. It's only when the guidance becomes final, then that's the one you can use. And so we are still working on going through the responses that were provided to our initial draft guidance, and now the plan is to actually put out a final guidance on that PCCP sometime soon. We're also planning to put out a draft guidance for AI, ML content and lifecycle management to allow the community to have an understanding of how FDA is thinking, and also get the community's feedback on how the agency should be regulating AI, ML devices going forward. We also, as mentioned here, developing content for different parties in the whole space from startups to full developed companies, and making sure that everybody's addressed, and also making sure that patients and their caregivers have their voice heard, and make that digital health resources are provided for all of them. So that's something we've been working on. Our plan is to have our first digital health advisory committee meeting by the end of this year. Hopefully that'll allow us to continue the engagement with the community, and also allow us to think about how we build software and technical expertise in this space. So let me go to the next slide. So as I said, like we are working in collaboration across different communities, and from left to right are some of the ways we've been doing this. We have something called CERCEs, which are the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, which there are 5 of them right now. If I'll try and remember, like I think it's Stanford, UCSF is one, Duke University is the second, University of Maryland, College Park, I think is the third, and Yale, Mayo are fourth, and Johns Hopkins University is the fifth one. So the basic aspect of this is that we have collaborations with academic institutions and build regulatory science research aspects, which is for those of you who are funded through the NIH, which is a different kind of science. I mean, everything is science in that space, but regulatory science is more focused on looking at how do you ensure that a product that goes out to market is safe and effective. And it gets complicated because unlike where you look at say at NIH, where you're doing basic and advanced science, you're not necessarily looking at what if scenarios. If a device goes out in the market, what are the worst case things that can happen? How are you going to monitor performance, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the questions that we start to tackle in regulatory science. Then we also have collaborative communities, and these are communities that have started up from grassroots communities, and basically FDA is invited to be part of these communities, and then we provide voice, like we listen in on these communities and help them work through some of the challenges related to medical devices. And so if FDA or CDRH doesn't spin up a community, it can be invited to be a part of a community. And the next one is we do public-private partnerships, which are basically like a broad agency announcement, BAAs, that we put out typically once a year. And these are basically like saying these are the topic areas of interest for the entire FDA, CDRH, the device center, the drug center, the biologic center, and so on and so forth. And then people submit their application, like academics and industry submit their regulatory science aspect of projects they would like to work on, which would help the FDA in its understanding or deployment of regulatory science. And so those are some of the partnerships that we build. We have a network of digital health experts we use, which we call Nodex. And this is basically a set of vetted experts from around the globe. And it's typically run through like nonprofit organizations or consortiums and something like that, so that we can work with these experts to understand where certain fields are. It's not asking questions about a specific product per se, but it's more about general questions about the class of products or some definitions, or like understanding where some field is going. So this is more of an as needed basis, and it's a voluntary kind of approach. And last, as I mentioned before, that we have this digital health inbox where anybody can come in with their question, and we will provide response, and or we'll connect you with the review teams or the review panel who would be potentially able to help guide you if you're coming in, if you plan to come in with a device or a product for review by the FDA. I'm going to break my talk into two particular components. One is something called guidances, and the second one is based on DHTs. Before I go forward, I wanted to ask if there were any questions on the content I provided up to now, and we can go forward if there aren't any.
I think we're good. And after guidances, you'll have another stop as well, Dr. Pai.
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks. Okay, so I know, like when I used to be at the NIH, like we used to be like very puzzled about guidance. It's like those are really hard to read, and like we used to wonder what is the FDA doing. And so I can sympathize with some of you who may roll your eyes when you see that 15 guidances have been released, and so there's a lot of complex content in these guidances, and it can be painful to read sometimes if you're not. So it's like any foreign language, right? If you don't understand what the person's speaking, then it's really hard to understand what they're trying to say. And so I would say that having been at the FDA for almost 5 years now, I find guidances, dare I say, beautiful documents. They are very valuable to understand how the agency is thinking and how different aspects of the industry are being evaluated. And think about it also in the aspects that a lot of these documents have to stand the test of time for at least 5 to 10 years. And so in some ways, a lot of these documents are forward-looking, and it's incredibly valuable to look through these and see how well constructed they are as from a future-proofing perspective. So having said that, I'm not going to go through all of these guidances, obviously, but I'm going to pick up some of these guidances which will help you understand like how the Digital Health Center is thinking about aspects of software and medical devices. But before I go through the guidances, there are some aspects which are unique to a regulatory body compared to, say, an NIH or any other federal body that I need to put forward. And so at the FDA, words matter more than in most other agencies. So we have to be careful when you use your words that what you say is the same thing for everybody. And so the first thing is, what do we mean by a medical device, right? And so this is a very wordy definition, but it's a legal definition. So this is based on the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that basically this is what a device is defined as. So the key things from a software perspective, which you tend to use most often, not always, but most often is the second one, which is basically that any of these things, instrument, apparatus, etc., which is intended for the use in the diagnosis of disease or other condition, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, or human or other animals. And so this is one of the main driving kind of thought process when you start thinking about, is your product a device or not? So as you can see, I separated out a product from a device. If you're outside the FDA, a device is a product, it's the same thing. But when you're talking about an authorized product or a regulated product, it becomes a device when it is fitting into these kind of boxes. And so when you are developing your product, then you have to look at the intended use, which is basically what you're saying, right? Intended for the use. And so you look at that intended use and say, okay, where am I doing any of these things, right? Is my product planning to do any of these things when it's going to market? And so if it is, then then the rules are like, okay, then it's a device that may or may not be under this kind of space. And the reason I put that kind of qualifier is, and I'll talk about that in the next few slides, that there are some constraints or some aspects based on how Congress has defined what comes from this, the definition of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So yeah, so that is mainly the main thing. The third one is mainly to separate out drugs from devices, right? Because basically or drugs and biologics from devices, because basically this part, the chemical action and metabolizing things are more in that space than device space. So that's what separates out. And so when you think about definitions, right, when you think about software-related definitions in this space, there are certain aspects we need to be defining upfront. One is that when we say function, here we're talking about a distinct purpose of a product. So it's not like a mathematical function in that sense. But here we're saying that it could be the intended use, or it could be a subset of the intended use. So if a product has multiple intended uses, then each intended use subset could be a function itself. So if it's just doing an analysis, then I mean, that's the one function that it has. Versus if it plans to store, transfer, and analyze data, then there's 3 different functions, which are 3 distinct purposes of that particular product. So remember that when we as an agency talk about function, we're talking about distinct purpose of that particular product. When we say device function, we're adding the qualifier device in front of it. Basically, that says that this function meets the definition of the device. So that's a function that fits under this kind of FD&C Act expectations. And then when we add the qualifier software, basically we're saying that it's not just, it's a software function that meets the definition of the device. So basically it's a software function that is going to be considered a device under this Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So so we call that DSF in short. So that's the main driver. And then we start thinking about, okay, any particular product, you'll have other functions or other aspects of that product, right? And so if you think about, like, if it's not going to be a device software function, then what are the functions that it has? So that's a function that would not necessarily meet the definition of a device, or if it meets the definition, it's not subject to pre-market review. And I'll talk about some of these as we go forward. Or if it meets the definition of device, but we believe it's not, there's no need to enforce the compliance with regulatory controls, primarily maybe because it's been proven to not be risky and the benefits are far outweigh the risk and the risk is very low. So those are sort of some of the typically what we would think about when you think about enforcement discretion kind of aspects. And when we talk about device function under review, basically what we're saying is that the function that is being reviewed by the FDA as part of a pre-market submission. So basically, if it's a device function, as you said, is a function that's a device. And so when you're reviewing it, it's being reviewed by the FDA. And then when you have a multiple function device, that's combining the other function, and your device software function, for example, or a device function. So basically, a multiple function device product. So when I'm talking through some of the guidances I present today, we'll use these words. And I wanted to be upfront about, like, what do we mean when we say these words? So for example, here it would be like, if a product has both a device function, which is this thing, and another function, which is not a device function, then it's a multiple function device product. Okay. I know this can be a lot of jargon sort of thing, but bear with me on this one. And then finally, the question becomes of intended use. Like, well, how do you define intended use? As I said, like, when you're going to market with your product, you want to, like, or you're coming to the FDA with a pre-market submission, say, hey, this is my product. This is the quote unquote intended use of the product. And then you go to market. And so if once you go out to market, if you have different claims on your product, on your website, or on your brochure, something like that, then, I mean, what's the real intended use, right? So there was an amendment made to the final rule in 2021, where we basically provided more clarity and direction as to what kind of evidence allows us to determine what's your product's intended use. And so it's not just what your express claims and representations are, but also what are the implied claims. Yeah, no, so going forward, like, so we wanted to help understand, like, how do we make sure that we can evaluate the product accurately and make sure that when it's out there in the real world, it's doing what it claims in its pre-market submission. So I need to go back to my deck. Let me see. Yeah. So that's how we frame this thing. So on one hand, you have all this function, device software function, device function. And on the other hand, you also have to be careful that when you're defining intended use of your product before, when you come to the FDA, you have clear definition. Okay, I'm going to go with this as my intended use when I go to market, and I'm actually going to sell it like that. And so those are some of the driving forces when you start thinking about, okay, I'm going to come with this product. And so if your intended use upfront is not defined clearly, then you have a problem, because then it's like sort of like curing cancer. You're trying to do everything under the sun. And so it's hard for an agency to help you out, because if you're not very clear on what you're going to go to the market with, it's really hard for anybody to help from a business perspective. The reason why I say that is basically when you talk about a regulatory pathway, right? Like when you want to come in to the agency, when you come to the agency saying, hey, this is my product, do I need FDA to look at it? And so first thing first, make sure your intended use is clean and carved out, and you're very clear on what you're going to the market with. And once you've decided that, then we can start talking about, as I mentioned earlier, like, okay, is it a device or not a device, right? If it's not a device, then the FDA doesn't have an oversight on that. That's fine. You have other agencies looking at it, but the FDA wouldn't necessarily have an agency look at it. Then there might be some devices where you might have enforcement discretion for whatever reason, and that's something you'd have to converse with the review body or review team, and or look at what other typical products have been cleared by the FDA under that spectrum. And finally, if the risk is high enough, then we would come into the FDA's oversight, and I will talk about the different risks on the next slide. But so yeah, just as a segue, we do have a database where it lists all the devices that have been cleared or approved or authorized, and also like what pathways they've been authorized to go to market with. And you can use that as a starting point for your particular product. Once you define, okay, this is the intended use of my product, then you go to this database and see who else has built or marketed or been authorized by the FDA to go to market with that particular type of device, right? You may think that you're unique, but not necessarily, right? You don't want to be that unique if you can avoid that, because it's more expensive to be unique. So, and see which way you want to play that kind of space. So when you talk about from a software function perspective, we have a risk-based evaluation. And so it's all going back to safe and effective and looking at benefit risk, right? And so starting from left to go to right, if you think about like any software function, for example, your smartwatch, which is just logging like how many steps you walked from a general health wellness perspective, then that's something that's basically you're using it to make general fitness condition tracking, in which case the FDA doesn't think about that as a device, and it's not regulated by the FDA. And it makes sense. You don't want to bring in exceedingly low risk devices where there's no reference or disease or condition to be regulated by versus by an agency, versus looking at higher risk devices which are more impactful to safety and effectiveness of the general population. So that is easy to understand. Then you go to the middle column, which is talking about enforcement discretion. And here, basically, we're saying that these are functions where they're basically providing like information that's reminders or guidance to different types of populations in the patient population, but they're not like very impactful at the risk scale, right? And so the risk is lower, so we have enforcement discretion. And so part of the thinking here is that also if a product has, like once it goes out, there's enforcement discretion. We say, okay, fine, you can go out, your risk is too low. And it turns out that when it goes out in the real world, the risk is increased because certain things change in life, or like some technologies come along which make this particular product more riskier. Then obviously the advantage of enforcement discretion is you can go back and say, okay, this needs to be, we need to go back and enforce regulatory review because the risk has increased. So enforcement discretion gives the leeway to the review division to decide, like, okay, how much is the risk of this device compared to its benefit and its utilization. And the most important one is obviously the risk is the highest is when you talk about software functions that have implications directly for patient use. And for example, here we show like if a lead is connected to a mobile platform and measuring the ECG from the patient, then obviously that's something that we want to have oversight over and understand how the particular product is designed and tested, validated. And so that's something that we would review. So that's sort of like how we think about your product. Again, if you take a look at these are all talking about intended uses. Like this is an intended use here, there's an intended use of that particular function on the middle. So once you know your intended use, it's much easier to know where you sit on the FDA space, which guidance applies to you. Talking about guidances, here are some of the key guidances that I'm going to talk about and how they potentially can impact from your software device function kind of perspective, or like looking at it from a digital health perspective, right? And so let me walk through them one by one. So the first thing is, like, as I said, like we have this definition of that I showed earlier, where we're basically saying like, okay, the device is defined in a certain way, but and anything that's not in that definition is not a device. And so we can just walk away if you're not a device. But the interesting thing is, like, there's a 21st Century Cures Act, which amended this definition. And so certain software functions, which if you looked at the original definition in the FD&C Act, would have been considered devices, are now no longer considered devices. And so those are not regulated by the FDA. So that's the what we call the Section 3060 of the 21st Century Cures Act. And this is a guidance document that we put out there. You can look at it from this website. But basically what it's saying is that the Congress amended the definition of the device and excluded certain software functions, which are mainly related to, say, for example, EHRs and for administrative support. And for like, this is again the general wellness aspect of things. And also for like, if you're thinking about just transferring or storing information between different software formats, for example, or if you're just changing or just displaying a data on a monitor, you don't necessarily need to have that display validated. I mean, again, you have to be careful here because it's only certain software functions, because there's some obviously may not be. And so you have to read through the guidance to see which software functions are contained in that space. And then obviously some of the aspects related to clinical decision support or CDS. And again, this is something that we have more clarity on in future slide. So again, I just want to be careful here that the key word here is certain, because it's not everything. So read the guidance, make sure that what you're trying to do is within that umbrella or not, because it may not necessarily be. And again, at the FDA, like I think any federal agency, the word depends runs heavily in our usage. And so a lot of these things, you got to be careful to make sure that your particular intended use fits in that kind of scope or not. And always, you're more than welcome to come and talk to us. And the agency, as I said, the digital health inbox is one place you can start. So the second document, which I think is a pretty valuable document, and this is one of the first guidance documents that I read, and it's always the one I go back to almost always, because it was, I think, 2019 or 2020 when this was released, and it's been first released, and it's been updated as other guidances have evolved. But this is the one which talks of broad brush strokes about, like, okay, when you think about device software functions, what are we talking about and why? I mean, what comes under like a device which is a medical device, whether it's something where we have enforcement discretion or where the regulatory oversight happens. And the nice thing about this guidance is also tells you like, okay, which platforms your general purpose computing platforms are not necessarily going to be considered devices, and they are basically there's going to be function specific aspects of it. And then also, like, if there's a risk to the patient, how are we going to look at it? And so if I remember correctly, the appendices have a lot of examples within each category of these three different categories I talk about here, and walk through like, okay, if your particular intended use is similar to this particular example, then you may be able to think about your product in that kind of space example. As always, talk to the agency to get clarity if you want to move forward. Again, here, the different examples, as I said, not medical devices versus enforcement discretion or regulatory oversight. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the general wellness policy. And so basically, when we say general wellness, we basically talking about two different distinct factors. One is that they have to be for only general wellness use, right? And the way we define general wellness is basically like they have to be as defined in the guidance, but they have to be presenting a low risk to the safety of the users and other persons. And so if we define them, we had two different categories for that. One was basically saying that, okay, if there's a total, the category one is the lowest risk category in the sense that it's basically saying there is a general claim, right? I mean, for a general state of health and doesn't go into any particular disease condition, for example, or disease or health condition. And so that's the most like the quote unquote safest kind of category. And then you go up a little bit higher when you say, if you think about category two, then you again think about general improvement. They may make a reference to a disease or condition, but they're not necessarily talking about that particular, trying to cure or treat or manage that particular disease. So for example, if you're tracking calories and helping to maintain a healthy weight and balanced diet, that's general wellness. And on the other end, a healthy weight and balanced diet may help living well with, say, for example, high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes. So it does connection to a disease, but it's a pretty broad spectrum, broad scope kind of advice or utilization. So when you talk about general wellness products, we don't plan to examine whether they are devices within the meaning of this of the FDA Act, and if they are devices, whether they will comply with pre-market review and post-market regulatory requirements. So general wellness devices are going to be under that category. The next one is clinical decision support, and here basically, we're talking about tools that are being used by healthcare professionals for developing person-specific or patient-specific information. And CDS basically is about talking about intelligent filtering that's being done for the data that's provided as input to a CDS system, and also presenting it at like the right time, right place kind of thing. And so these are some of the examples that are provided here for different types of CDS, and the Office of the National Coordinator has a lot of documentation related to CDS. And we wrote, as I mentioned in the previous slide, there was this 3060 Cures Act aspect where certain aspects of CDS was not necessarily considered device. But then we then clarified some of the aspects of what CDS applies for a device perspective. And so this is how we define, we in the guidance for CDS software. And this chart is just a cheat sheet, but it's not exhaustive in the sense that you should always refer back to the guidance to make sure that your example or your intended use fits within some of these examples or not. And these are also non-exhaustive examples, a lot more than this. So the point here is that when you think about CDS, whether it's a device or a non-device, you have to go through these steps on the top row, which is basically saying you have to clear step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4 before you can be considered device or non-device. So if your software function does not acquire, process, or analyze medical images, then you cleared step 1, right? But if it does do any of these things, then you are considered a device CDS. You don't go forward to step 2 anymore. So basically, you have to clear all 4 sequentially. And so typically what happens is that there are we have not seen any non-device examples which have this, right? So in the sense that most examples where you have like signal acquisition systems or in vitro diagnostics are basically any software function that is acquiring, processing, or analyzing medical images automatically going to be a device CDS. So you're not going to be able to meet this criteria. On the other hand, if you clear that, if a software function does not do any of these things, it just the image is already there. And then the question is, does your software do any of these kind of analysis, right? And if it's doing, and is it doing for things that are normally communicated between healthcare professionals? So again, it depends on how we do that. And so, for example, if it's related to ECG or continuous signal, where some of these things are not normally communicated between healthcare professionals, so in that case, it will be considered a device CDS. On the other hand, if it's something that's normal communication between healthcare professionals and its functions that are like not necessarily looking at patterns or signals, then it's something that, like, for example, a report from an imaging study, that would be considered a non-device example. So having done that, then you can go to the next step and say, okay, I cleared step 1, step 2. Do I make it to step 3 or not? And so in this case, is it a recommendation or is it providing a specific output or directive? Is it saying, hey, for this patient, based on the analysis I've done, this is the thing you need to do, versus it saying, hey, these are the probabilities or these are the recommendations like you make your call. And so a lot of that depends on, like, so for example, a risk score that you come out with, definitely we consider a device CDS. And like if you're providing, like if you're in the emergency room and like it's a health critical kind of situation, and if a decision is being provided, a recommendation is being provided by the software, at that point, the clinician doesn't have the time to necessarily think through what are their options, right? And so time critical outputs are definitely coming under device CDS, and those are things that the agency would regulate and look at. There are some non-device examples here. For example, if you're looking at, we're just providing options, right? I mean, you're just saying, okay, these are different preventive options, these are the diagnostic options, these are treatment options. You pick, you do what you want to do. And so that's different, right? And so some of these things are, I mean, usually what happens is a lot of times they're not as clean and clear cut. There's going to be a lot of nuances to your particular intended use product. And so the recommendation would be to come and talk to the agency and say, okay, if you're going to be doing this particular intended use, you will be regulated. If you're doing something else, you may not necessarily be regulated. So talk to us. And the last one is obviously, like, if a software function can provide the basis of why it made the decisions, right? And why it made the recommendation that it does. So that the healthcare provider is not automatically locked in, like they don't understand necessarily like how we came to the decision, how the software came to the decision it did. So that's something that's a problem. So, and this has been typically a problem with AI devices, where it's sometimes hard to understand, or a lot of times hard to understand when these are black boxed AI algorithms, that how did the decision get made. And so almost always we've seen those devices get come in as device CDS and have to be regulated by the FDA. On the other hand, if it's like a algorithm which is very well specified, it's a very simple algorithm and which is very clearly understandable by the HCP, like, hey, this is the logic and this is the flow, then may not necessarily be something that would be regulated. And so basically, just to add on, to close out that particular chapter here, any of these functions, like, they are independent of the platform on which they run. So it's not necessarily that if you're on the cloud versus if you're on a Apple server or on an Apple Watch or on a Fitbit platform or something, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, these are functions that are independent from that aspect. And then when you think about any sort of function that does not meet the definition, then they are called non-device CDS. So they are basically CDS that's not a device, so it's a non-device CDS. So again, remember, the device is something that comes under the FD&C Act. So when you say non-device, it means it doesn't come under that. So it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Just moving a little bit faster. I know I'm going a little bit too slow, I think, but a lot of topics here. A couple more guidances I wanted to go through. So this is another one where we talk about multiple function devices. Basically, as you say, as like any particular product when you're coming in, you'll have for example, a general purpose computing platform on which your particular app is sitting. So the general purpose computing platform would be considered as a other function, right? It has its own functions, it's doing its own thing. So you would not necessarily regulate it. On the other hand, you want to, as an agency, if your particular product, which sits on top of the general purpose computing platform, needs to connect to it and also needs updates, and if an update in the general purpose platform crashes your app, that's a problem. So we need to understand, like, from that purpose, like, how does the other function interact with your function? And so the safety and effectiveness of the interaction, like, in that angle would be something we would look at. And so that's what we're saying here, that when you think about safety and effectiveness, that think about, like, when you're building your product on top of a platform or building with other functions in it, try to separate out, like, make sure that the aspects of your review part of the function is clean and clear cut, and there's minimum risk involved with interaction between the other function and you're at risk, or the function that's being evaluated by the FDA. And so when we say other function, basically it's a function that doesn't meet the definition of device, or is not subject to pre-market review, or has enforcement discretion, right? And so when you're building, so this all comes into your thinking process from the beginning, even before you actually build your product, because by the time you build your product and come to the FDA, it's almost too late to think about, okay, how am I going to cleave out my other function from my regulated function? Because at that point, everything is tied in. So you want to think about all these aspects before you start building a product. So I think from product development perspective, you have to think about, like, at the beginning itself, you're thinking about your intended use. Also think about how you're building your software, right? How are you building your solution for your functions and making sure that the other functions from your regulatory function are clean and that your quality control checks placed started to be set up before you actually come to the point where, hey, I'm going to go talk to the FDA. Because if you think about it that late, it's going to be more expensive for you as a startup or as a regular company that's developing these products. And I know I walked through several guidances, and as I showed before, there are 15 guidances out there, plus and they're increasing as we speak. So we decided to build this tool called the Digital Health Policy Navigator, which is basically sort of walking through these different tools that I talked about, these guidances that I talked about. And basically it's helping you understand for your particular intended use, where does which guidance applies, which does not apply, and whether you fit in which space do you fit in. You have to be careful here that it doesn't actually talk you through like how you should design, develop, and test your software function. There are other guidances related to that and standards which can help. The other thing is it doesn't talk about, say, software that's being used for drugs or biologics. We are not, this is only focused on devices. And also it doesn't talk about electronic consent forms and things which are not necessarily devices. So there are 7 steps, and you can see that on the right is a snapshot of step 6. But step 6 sort of gives you a hint of what kind of view it is. Like this is talking about the CDS software. And if you look at the 7 steps, there's alignment with the guidances that I talked about. For example, there's look at administrative general wellness, EHR, MDDS. These are related to the 21st Century Cures Act, and then there's CDS, and then the MMA guidance that I talked about, where a broad spectrum of device software functions are evaluated or discussed in that guidance. And so you can start from 1 and walk down. It'll take you down the whole pathway saying, okay, if your software functions intended for a medical purpose, how would you go? Yes or no? And depending on how you answer that question, you start flowing down this kind of pipeline as to where your particular product or device would fit. And then it also allows you to figure out, okay, which review division or who do I talk to at the FDA kind of space. I mean, most likely, I think the best option is to reach out to our inbox and start from there. So I'm going to pause here before switching topics. I know it's 40 plus minutes in. So
yeah, no, we've already gotten a question here.
Okay.
Dr. Permetter, I don't know if you want to unmute, but she was asking about
I can unmute.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think for some of us that operate in a research context, we may sometimes say test certain softwares that may do things like support a healthy lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And it becomes confusing about that reference to condition, such that even if our software doesn't reference a condition, our eligibility criteria for the thing that we're studying might. And so it can be really confusing as to whether or not that affects the classification of the software that we're using. And I've been part of some discussions where there's just a lot of argument and back and forth because that aspect is not very clear.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I said, it depends is a common word across our agency.
Yeah.
No, I mean, totally. So I think a lot of times it goes back, and I think I come to that in a future slide. I don't think I've talked about it yet. Maybe I did, and I don't think I think I'll be coming to it in the next slide. But basically, like we talk about, like when we are talking about software being used in a, so I'm assuming this is in a research setting, right? The university setting.
Right.
Yeah, so we do have, I think some of my later slides talk about that, but like the aspects related to IDE or aspects related to IRB and human subjects protection, those apply anyway, right? And so you think about it from that angle. And so it becomes a question. If you go back to, say, the DSF MMA guidance, it clearly defines who is the person or who's the entity responsible for that particular product, right? So for example, you talk about software. Now, if it's being done in-house versus if it's so if it's done in-house and if it's only being used within your own hospital setting, then the IRB and human subject protection rules, and you're not actually selling to other entities or anything like that, right? So I would say the simpler, I mean, the best answer would be that you should reach out to a digital health inbox, because this is a question we get often, and we have had this resolved before, that So there are variations on this, right? For example, and I go to, and then some of the future slides here, I'll talk about it. But like, for example, if your software is being used as part of a clinical trial for the drug, right? And so in that case, then it's a device in our thinking, but it also depends on whether it's being used only for that trial and not never going to be used for anything else, right? So then it's like an IDE space, but then there are rules to that, and that's what I'll talk about in my subsequent slides. But on the other hand, if it's a PhD student developing it in-house and they're not going to share it with anybody, just going to do a publication like our previous speaker was talking about, then it's a different, I mean, it's not necessarily something we will get involved in. The IRB would make a call on that first, right? I mean, the IRB will say, is it safe and effective? Like, is it helping the subjects or not? If it's, the IRB has to play a big role in that angle because they have to be telling. And so usually it depends on the risk, right? Significant versus non-significant risk to the patient and the population who's being studied. And so under that condition, if there's a significant risk, then the FDA would get involved. And because I think the IRB should be telling you that reach out to the FDA and ask them about this particular, what are you trying to do here? And so then we would.
If her IRB says inclusion criteria, people with obesity, but it's general, the application, will they consider that it's disease specific? Or right, because it's more general.
Nabil, that's exactly what's happening at our institution right now.
But it also depends on what exactly is the software doing, right? So that's the thing.
And one other question I have is if you're just storing, transferring, analyzing data and not reporting back to the user, does it then, do you see what I'm saying, or providing them with sort of feedback about their data? Does that fall under software as a medical device?
So again, so I'm trying to avoid using the word depends. But no, I mean, like, okay, so you're storing the data and doing nothing with it?
No, you are, but you could potentially be letting clinicians or others do the diagnosis and treatment based on the data, but there's no sort of direct reporting from the actual device itself or app or system.
So at the end of the day, it depends on what is going back to the end user, right? The end user in this case doesn't necessarily have to always be the patient. It can be the healthcare professional too. So if your software is taking that data and making, for example, if it's an AI model sits on top of it and makes some kind of culling of the data or like modeling or something of that nature and making outcome predictions. Now, in that case, the product that you have is basically the intended use is like provide outcome measures or provide recommendations to the physicians based on the data I collected. So in that case, now you would have to come in based upon what kind of predictions you're making, what kind of specificity you have. Like, for example, based on the data I collected for patients, you say the risk for this particular patient to have a cardiac event is this much. Now that's a high risk from our perspective. Like you're making a call for a patient and a physician, and we need to know how you're making that call. Versus if you just take the data and tell the physician, hey, your data is here, you do what you want, that's different, right? You're not doing anything to the data, you're just moving from point A to point B. Versus like, and so that's part of the MDDS versus like if you're doing analysis on it, right? For if you take that data and do some filtering, or if you do some processing on it, if it's put some waveform analysis, something, now you already changed the data, right? So it's no longer what you started with, you actually modified it. And so now we need to know, well, did you do it correctly or not, right? I mean, you might have removed the most significant aspect of the data from it, in which case it's a higher problem for the physician.
That makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, all of us start from the best intent, but then it depends on like how it goes when it reaches the patient or the physician at that point.
Wonderful. That makes sense. Makes sense. Any other questions? I know you have a whole another section, so just got about 8 or 10 minutes left.
Okay, I'll try and go quicker. Let's see, I'm trying to go back to my slide. Let's see. Yeah, so I don't know how much familiarity is with DHTs in this community. I assume there was, but I just wanted to not assume that too much. But anyway, here's the definition of how FDA looks at it. And this is a definition that builds on the FDA NIH best glossary that existed, has been built, I think for like, I want to say like last 10 years, but I could be totally wrong, but it's in that ballpark. So anyway, so DHT, the way we define it in this particular guidance is basically a system that uses computing platforms, connectivity, software, and or sensors for healthcare and related uses. And these are some of the wide range of aspects of utilization of DHTs that we have seen so far. Let's see. And so when we think about DHTs, we basically look at it fit for purpose, right? How is it going to fit the purpose that's intended to be used for? And we look at not just the function part of it, that is what its purpose within the clinical investigation is being used for, but also its form, right? And so how is it being designed for the particular populations being trained to use? Now, remember when I said DHT, we're not talking about like just the variables, but or anything hardware, but we're also talking about software. And so any software solution that's a DHT also has to address these kind of questions and consideration. So this guidance, I'll be talking about in a few seconds, I think. It's basically talking about how you look through, how you think through how you build your DHTs in that spacing. And so when we talk about DHTs, we are thinking about it from 4 different angles as being valuable for medical products. And on one hand is obviously decentralized clinical investigations, and we saw from the pandemic, and also from like looking at rural versus urban distribution of the population, that there's value in there's these technologies being able to provide us more input and information about the populations without spread far out, and getting that to help build a better health system. And so that's part of it, and also allows us to look at from a longitudinal perspective, both from a clinical, like a patient in the clinic and to the patient or when they go to the home, and also for general healthy living, right? You want to make sure that people are tracked before they become sick rather than just waiting to get till they get sick. And so some of that aspect, and then the aspect related to real world data and making sure that we can capture the infrequent events, right? And the things that are going on, like now you may not necessarily capture them if you just have them in the hospital, but if these DHTs are with them, you can capture events like arrhythmias or sleep apnea and those kind of aspects, and see how the social and environmental factors are influencing how their health situation is evolving. So, I mean, these are a lot of different uses for DHTs that has been shown to be valuable so far, and it's continued to increase its utility. So as I said, we have this guidance which we just released, which is it's a final form, so you can use this to try some of your thinking. It provides recommendation how you can use DHTs for clinical investigations, and allows like how do you accelerate, like making sure that the medical products that you're developing are done in the appropriate way from a DHT perspective. Let's see. And so this is just sort of a breakdown of the various aspects of the guidance. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these. And the key things to see are the appendices here. Like the first appendix talks about different types of DHTs that have been used or potentially could be used in a clinical investigation. Obviously, we don't show specific examples. These are more hypothetical cases. And also, like, for example, like you could see how do you walk through selecting a DHT for a clinical investigation and justifying the endpoint for which it's being used, primary or secondary. And so, let's see. Some of the recommendations in the guidance are talking about like how do you select DHTs that are suitable for use, and how do you describe these DHTs when you're coming in as a regulatory submission, and like make sure that you verify and validate these DHTs, and how do you make sure that you can use the DHT for collecting data for clinical trial endpoints, and understanding the risks that are there for your particular DHT within the clinical investigation, and protecting data, and what are the roles and responsibilities for their use. And so some of these things obviously have some overlaps with the roles of IRBs to some extent, and then obviously the significant, non-significant risk plays out. Again, here we don't talk about DHT being necessarily a device or not, and also because that's covered in the other guidances that I talked about. And also, like if you want to do changes for a clinical outcomes assessment, then that's something that's totally independent of this, because that would be a separate guidance. Let's see. As I said, like we have this definition that I showed earlier. What is a device, right? And so some of these DHTs may not be these things, that they're not intended for these aspects of things, and some of them may. And what we do is like when do we need to have an IDE sent to the FDA, right? And so when you talk about DHTs, if they're a device, right? And so you have to look at the significant risk versus a non-significant risk. And so If it's a significant risk device, then you have to look at the information that's required for an IDE, which is given in the 21 CFR 812.20. And so long as that information is provided within an IND application, then we don't need you to come in with a separate, I generally don't need you to come in with a separate IDE application. So here, investigational device exemption and independent new drug application. So this, if it's being used as part of a drug application, right, then you don't need a separate one if the information is, generally don't need a separate one if the information is present within that IND submission to CDER. And so if it's a non-significant risk device, then you don't need a separate IDE application so long as the investigation complies with the requirements. And then if it's a device that's already been cleared or approved by the FDA for use and it's being used within that intended use space, you don't need a separate IDE. So if it's for a software device that's already been authorized to market for that intended use or indications for use, you can just use it as is. As I said before, like you have to make sure that IRB and human subject protections and other clinical practice regulations had to be followed. Again, if it has a marketing authorization, you can use it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's appropriate for use, right? I mean, you have to be making sure that you're using it in the right, it's fit for purpose. That just because you have a DHT that's authorized and you have a clinical trial doesn't mean that you should just marry the two together. It has to make sure that whatever biomarker that you plan to get from your DHT, the DHT is invalidated to provide that particular biomarker content. And the validation is sufficient quality that it can be used for that particular trial. So make sure that all the lines, the T's are crossed and I's are dotted kind of space. Then also, like, you want to make sure that the DHT is actually informing the clinical investigation endpoint. There's no point in getting an DHT measurement. It doesn't help you understand anything about your clinical trial endpoint. Like, why are you doing this? And it's like a waste of money and time. So it's a lot of commonsensical aspects to this, but make sure that we follow that. Then design controls. So basically, design controls are requirements that the device that you're designing will perform as it's intended to perform. And so there are aspects related to that. And so this goes back to the question that was raised. Like if your device does not have a marketing authorization and is only being used in a clinical investigation, then how do we assess that particular aspect from a design perspective? And so in that situation, what you have to do is, if the guidance walks you through the aspects related to that, but also mainly like if you perform the types of V&V activities that are recommended, then we typically don't ask for compliance with design control requirements when applicable. But remember, this is only within the context of use in a clinical investigation for remote data collection. It's not being used for outside of that space. So if you take that approval or this okay, and then say, oh, I'm going to market this for other aspects, and that's a no. So make sure that you follow that. And so I think the guidance talks through about how do you define like verification and validation activity for your DHT that satisfies the design control requirements, that it actually will perform as intended and will satisfy the requirements for the clinical investigation. Fit for purpose, I think basically like want to make sure that it measures the thing of relevance for a clinical trial. I'm going to skip this. It's basically a treat like any other endpoints. There's nothing specific that's outside of that space, but make sure it aligns. Think about the risks for the patients when you're using DHTs, again, clinical risks and privacy-related risks. Let's see, I just want to close out. And the last one is basically make sure that you plan for changes that might happen. Like, for example, if your DHT is going to have an update in the middle of your trial, how are you going to manage that process? And how are you going to make sure there are no measurement inconsistencies? And then making sure that you log all the changes that are happening and ensuring that even if there are updates, that the DHT remains fit for purpose, that you need to do additional validation, you have to do it, because if otherwise then the trial is worthless. You lose a lot of time and data and money and effort. So a lot of these things are applicable across the board. And so be careful that this doesn't mean that it only applies to devices you bring, but also if the participant brings their own device or DHT to the platform of a clinical trial, then this still applies. So it's not just devices you bring yourselves. Yeah, I think I ran over, but my apologies on that. I'm closing out with this slide. We have our website. You can always reach out to the digital health inbox with any question that you may have. I given my email also if you want to reach out to me directly too.